Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Abhijit Iyer-Mitra, one of the most vociferous commentators on international issues on Indian Twitter, or should I say Indian X. Abhijit is, for many years has been, a very astute geopolitical watcher. He was recently in Israel. He is a senior fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies based in New Delhi, but travels around the world and does a lot of work in defense issues. I want to talk to Abhijit today a little bit about his experiences of his Israel trip, and also what he makes of the Gaza situation, and of course what has just happened, the swarm attack by Iran on Israel and what happens next. Abhijit, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, Hindol. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Abhijit, let's begin by what just happened. You had some rather strong comments about what might happen next, including, distances as you were measuring them from Israeli nuclear facilities, Iranian nuclear facilities, and of course the attack that happened with all the swarm drones and missiles on Israel. Talk to us a little bit about where you see the situation stand at this point in time, now that there's a lot of pressure on Israel not to respond to this attack. And many people say that this was a pre-planned attack, in a sense, just to, showcase that something had been done by Iran, but nothing very serious in real terms. In fact, only one Muslim girl, actually, very sadly, a little girl has died, apart from, and not much, I'm sorry, not much else has happened in a sense in Israel, correct?
Correct. So there's two parts to this. One is, where things stand. And the second is where it's going to go. Now, to understand that, we first need to understand where the Israeli notion of deterrence comes from. Most of us, when we talk about deterrence, because most of the literature out there is Anglophone literature of nuclear powers, right? Either Indian literature or American or British literature, or countries like New Zealand and Australia, which live under a US nuclear umbrella in that sense. So what ends up happening is our views of deterrence are all taken from US strategic bombing, Curtis LeMay in the Second World War, which was all, destroying entire German cities to deter them. And essentially, nuclear weapons took on that role, that if you hit us, we will destroy your cities kind of thing.
A mad scenario, so to speak.
Exactly. But Israeli deterrence is actually a much, much more limited concept. It actually comes from a lot of legalistic principles. And what it focuses on is they know that there's going to be repeat rounds. They know you can't perpetually deter someone from small attacks, or I won't call the 7th of October a small attack, but anyway, of smaller attacks. And how to prolong the distance or the time between those attacks, right? And so it's a combination of attacking your leadership to make you scared. It's a combination of taking out your ammunition dumps and your capability in order to attrit you down to a point where you're never confident enough to take them on in any large numbers. So this is where they come from. Now, that said, we also need to remember that Iran is, for want of a better word, a second world country in that sense. They were well on their way to becoming a first world country. In 1979, their per capita income and their industrialization was higher than South Korea and Taiwan. And that so-called Islamic revolution essentially aborted the entire process. So what ends up happening is that you have this thing where you have one ossified society. And in those days, Israel was actually dirt poor. And now they've become a fantastically rich society, one of the richest Western countries around, to such an extent that even after, 3 years, I got a price shock, because right now a packet of chips in Tel Aviv costs about 400 rupees, which is insane. Imagine for a packet of potato chips that cost 40 rupees here, you're literally paying 10 times that amount there. So very rich. And the problem then becomes that a second world society looks for quantity solutions, a first world society looks for quality solutions. So what's ended up happening is that you've had Iran, which launched this massive attack, about 180 odd drones, 80-odd cruise missiles and about 110 ballistic missiles to last count. And that entire thing, if you look at any of the open source literature on pricing Iranian weapons, no more than maximum $200 million, right?
Yes.
More likely about 100 to $120 million because they're extremely price sensitive.
And
The
many of
difference.
these missiles were things that are made in Iran, from what I understand, right? The Shahid missiles and so on and so
Exactly.
forth, right?
They're all made in Iran. They're all completely indigenous to Iran. No parts imported, no software imported, no nothing imported. Maybe the chips for the guidance chips are imported, say, from China or something like that, which is ordinary car, car computer chips and things like that. But other than that, all made in-house in Iran. And it is a new technology. We need to remember this. This is 80-year-old technology. A cruise missile is essentially a V1, a German V1 rocket, and a ballistic missile is essentially a German V2 rocket. So, it's not particularly new technology.
No, King Edge.
Exactly. And it's very basic physics in that sense. It's not really quote unquote rocket science, even though we are talking about rockets here. So what ends up happening is they've spent this much. The official estimate or quasi-official estimate coming out of Israel on how much they spent, and this is only an estimate, unlike Iran, where you can gauge the amount through open source intel, Israel, we can't, is about $1.3 billion on
Tell
defending.
me, Abhijit, I saw that number and I think you also tweeted this. Does that seem too much to you, or does that seem
No,
accurate?
it does seem accurate. I'll tell you why. It's, the cost of putting F-15s, F-16s, and F-35s up in the air. They're extremely expensive to put up in the air, especially F-35s, because, you're costing maintenance and things like that. Then even the price of the missiles that these planes fire, each one of those missiles would have probably cost 2-3 times the amount of the missiles that they were shooting down. And AMRAAM, which is the standard air-to-air missile that one of these planes would use, would cost anywhere between $150,000 to $250,000 per unit, possibly with inflation. It would have gone up to about $500,000 to $1 million a unit. And imagine using $1 million missile to intercept a drone that costs something like $15,000 to $20,000. The economics of it doesn't work out. So in the Israeli mind, because I told you it comes from a very legalist attrition perspective, they see this as not a defensive strategy that they've used, hasn't imposed costs on Iran.
Yes.
The cost has
That's right.
just been $200 million max. The cost for Israel has been 1.3 billion. So it's not a question of how many people died. It's a question of this, if this is allowed to continue, if this paradigm is allowed to continue, that Iran is allowed to strike Israel without consequence. In the long run, it'll become completely unsustainable for Israel. So what ends up happening is with these guys, they want to impose a proportionate cost on the Iranians, either in terms of high profile enough lives or a high profile enough target, which may not cost the same, but the knockdown effects in intelligence loss or electronics loss or capacity loss would be insane.
No, Abhijit, of course, Iran would argue that this was triggered by the latest Damascus, attack by Israel, taking out one of its, prime sort of military assets. In a sense, a man who replaced what Qasem Soleimani, once did, right? Now, if there is a repercussion, another very high-profile target is taken out. In your assessment, what are the chances of this sort of blowing up and, basically going a bit out of control?
Mm. So again, let's split it into two. One is where this started, and second is where this is going in terms of escalation. So where this started is, see, we need to ask ourselves, what the hell was this IRGC general doing in Damascus?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
the Syrian civil war is, for all effects and purposes, over, right?
Over.
Just some holdouts in a very small strip in the north
Mhm.
of Syria, which there is no war in Syria right now.
Mhm.
So what was this guy doing? He was basically coordinating everything that was happening in northern Israel and southern Lebanon, sitting in Damascus, sitting in the comfort of Damascus, number one. Number two, we need to realize that a good 20-kilometer strip of northern Israel has been depopulated, fearing Hezbollah raids. So all of them have been moved south. They've been put into hotel rooms at great expense to, like I told you, one packet of chips costs 400 rupees. There is not a hotel room in Tel Aviv, a five-star hotel room, that's going to cost you anything less than about $600-700 a night. So they've been put up there for the last, 5-6 months continuously, for a very long time. And, the knockdown effects on economic activity have been very severe. So what was this guy doing? But the second part of it is accountability. You see, they've never admitted that they bombed it. The embassy in Damascus, the consular section, was bombed. But we know it's the Israelis, but just knowing it's the Israelis isn't enough. You have to have attributability in an attack. This is very much like Iran attacking the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 96 or 97 or 98, I forget when, in which, Danny Carmon, who was the Israeli ambassador to India, his first wife died in that attack. So, the Israelis never went after the Iranians for that in a state-to-state attack. On the other hand, India did something very similar that Iran did. When we had a sub-state actor, we shouldn't call them non-state actors, they're sub-state actors, attacked our convoy in Pulwama, we responded with a state-on-state attack, right? So in many ways, Iran has kind of broken a rule of the game. We did not think it was going to be a state-to-state attack till the last 72 hours when the Iranians basically announced it was going to be a state-to-state attack. But the one thing that we knew for sure was there was going to be some kind of a retaliation for that killing. Because remember, when the Americans actually killed Soleimani, that was a state-on-state attack. And the Iranians responded with a ballistic missile attack on an American airbase, for which the Americans did not respond. Now, let's look at the second part of the question, which is the response, counter-response dynamics. Remember, just a few months back, the Iranian militants based out of Pakistan carried out an attack on a police station in the Iranian province of Sistan wa Balochistan, killing about 15 cops out there. And Iran responded with a missile attack on Pakistan, on what it called terrorist camps. And Pakistan responded to that, but then there was no further escalation from Iran. The thing here is how much Israel is almost certainly going to respond. We don't know how they're going to respond, but because I've said, from their view of deterrence, not responding would be catastrophic down the line. They're probably right about that as well. So what happens is, how do we gauge what Iran's response will be? One is the Israelis could take out a very significant target but not announce it. The second is they could go in for an assassination campaign, which is actually very expensive in the long term. It's probably cheaper to send an F-35 with one guided bomb and drop that one guided bomb in a high-value target than to set up all the intelligence assets and all the dangers associated with it to go around killing people in Tehran or Shiraz or Qom or wherever. But the Iranian response, we still don't know, because a lot of deterrence is bluff. Sometimes you say you're going to do things which you will either never do or you don't have the capacity to do, right? So there's not much we can realistically predict. These are basically just intelligent guesses. And even at the state level, they just remain that intelligent guesses. Israel will do something and we don't know what the Iranians will do. But factor this in, even though this was a relative low-cost attack by Iran, their defense budget is about $10 billion. The Israeli budget is 3 times that amount, not factoring in American aid and things like that. So how many attacks of $200 million each can the Iranians afford? Because that is literally about what? 1/15th, no, not 1/15th, but about 1/100th of your budget right there. 10 times. Yeah, so, it's tough. It's tough predicting how that works. Let's see. There's no guarantee. A lot of it will depend on how the Israelis respond. That would be a crucial determinant of how the Iranians respond as well.
We'll talk a little bit, we'll expand this a little bit further and talk about Hezbollah and the situation in Gaza. But before that, I want to talk to you a little bit about Israel yourself. I understand the point you make about Tel Aviv being expensive. I, of course, went to Tel Aviv at a time when it was absolutely peaceful. And yet, there was a palpable sense that it was an expensive place. Now, of course, it would be very different. Talk to us a little bit about your experience of actually being in Israel at this point in time. Like I said, I went, it was absolutely peaceful. You're going in a very different, you went this time in a very different circumstances. What was the mood like in Israel? What did you sense? What did you feel? There are consistent reports that Netanyahu is embattled in some senses. His government is embattled. There are all kinds of, voices speaking up. What was your sense from the ground?
Look, Israel is exactly as it's been in my previous 10, 11 visits to that country. They're very resilient that way. They deal with grief differently than we do. They don't forget. Indians tend to forget. Israelis don't forget, but they're going on with life. Nightclubs are functioning, discos are functioning, people are going out for dinner. Nobody's actually in mourning even now, except the families of the hostages, which is a horrible situation to be in because you don't even know if you're
Yeah.
near here, are alive or dead, or in what conditions they're being held, are they being tortured, etc., etc. So it's a society that goes on. That said, I did not get the sense that Netanyahu was embattled. In fact, in my previous visits, there was a much more open willingness to criticize Netanyahu or the government of the day than there is right now. Right now, there is this sense that there's a time to get rid of Netanyahu. This isn't the time that we're going to be talking about it.
That's very different from what newspaper reports, especially in the West, suggest, right? I mean, what you're saying is very, very different from, what we're reading in the press. So that's
Absolutely. I
interesting.
mean, newspapers in the West almost always get it wrong because, these are people, clueless chaps who are parachuted in for 3 or 4 year stints
Right.
and suddenly think that going to, high society clubs, they somehow have acquired 20, 30 years worth of ground experience in any given country. So I never take the Western press seriously on these things. I take the New York Times very seriously when there's insider reports in Washington, but their reports on anything even outside of Washington, say in Texas or Florida, I will not take seriously. I would much rather take some OnlyFans porn account more seriously on going on in Texas and Florida than I would
Um,
the New York Times.
Fair
Um,
enough.
for
Yes.
example, the Guardian correspondent here, Hannah
Yeah.
Ellis Peterson, she spent 1 year in Bangkok before this, and that was her first political posting. Imagine,
Oh, yeah, yeah. I saw you mention that.
and
Yes.
before that, she was an art and culture correspondent. Can you beat that? Sending somebody absolute clueless bimbo to a country like this, that is so complex that even people like us feel like we're, infants.
Constantly.
In India,
Constantly.
you next year, you'll feel that anything you said the previous year, you felt like a complete idiot saying it, right? Because we
Right.
learn every year about our own country.
Right.
And
Right.
it's essentially much more complex and much more linguistically and culturally diverse than the entire EU put together,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Right.
So it's one of those things where I don't take the Western press seriously. But going there, is there anger? Sure. But is Netanyahu embattled? No. I don't think I've ever come across less political infighting in Israel during my visits than I have this time around.
Believe, we have our own infighting in our politics, but Israeli infighting is also something to behold.
Israel is one of those, it's in terms of infighting, it's almost aspirational for me. And I've attended these, closed door military conferences on
Mm.
tactics where, a junior officer will come in to speak after his commanding officer. And he will criticize the commanding officer viciously, say the nastiest of things about the CEO's tactics, and say you're basically leading us into a death trap. This is the most incompetent strategy I've ever heard of, etc., etc. And after the end of the conference, they're perfectly good friends will go out and share a beer and things like that. See, they're a very blunt society to the point where a lot of Indians would consider them to be rude.
Good.
But
Yes.
I would much rather prefer you have an
Yes.
absolutely acrimonious exchange and
Rather
leave
than
that acrimony in the room. And it's a genuine uh, clash of views. It isn't the kind of rhetorical showmanship that you see in India, which is all faff essentially. Because in most of those conferences, I'm like, dude, like this guy made a lot of sense, but this guy is also making a heck of a lot of sense. And if you actually work out both scenarios, they essentially boil down to preferences, but both are equally valid. So it's been this is why I keep going back to Israel. But because every time I go back to Israel, I learn something completely new about military and military strategy, which leaves you completely gobsmacked.
Let's talk a little bit about the Gaza war now, Abhijit. And in recent developments, there's a lot of pressure on Israel to allow more aid into Gaza, especially after the last big hospital, the Rafah hospital, if I'm not mistaken, was bombed. Western pressure has built up. I mean, there's constant reports that the Americans want the Israelis to do more. What was your sense about the response of the Israelis on what's happening in Gaza at the moment and what's likely to happen there in the weeks and months to come? In some parts, I believe the Israelis from some parts of Gaza, the Israeli troops have withdrawn. So what's likely to happen next?
So when I was there, there wasn't a single. We spent about 2 days touring the entire Negev border with Gaza,
Yes. Yeah.
and there wasn't a single blast or a bomb that we heard. And it's not very long. It's about 64, 70 kilometers long. So if a blast goes off, even in the southern extreme, you can hear it in the northern extreme. It's not like India where you've got constantly honk, 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 and tractors and construction. You can hear things from very, very far away. So what ended up happening was this was at a time when talks were happening in Cairo, where the Israelis essentially admitted to us that they had withdrawn from Khan Yunis almost completely in order to facilitate those talks on hostage return and a longer ceasefire than has been seen in the past. So for all effects and purposes, there was a ceasefire on the ground, and that's been broken today after almost 7, 8 days now, when there was a targeted bombing somewhere in Rafah. Now, what they're doing is they're basically holding back on Rafah because Rafah is where all the remnants of, think of this as that last battle of Jaffna Peninsula, right? Where all the LTT were gathered on a beach and they were
Yes.
using their own civilians as human shields. They're all now, all of Hamas is now gathered in Rafah, and they are essentially hiding behind their civilians as a human shield.
Sure.
It's going to be an extremely difficult campaign. This was the campaign that in many ways Israel has been waiting for. In fact, they have called up 2 more reserve divisions, and 2 divisions is a lot of people, right? They've called 2 more of those up in order to deal with it, because what they're going to do, as I get it, is to, and what we had actually speculated about 6, 7 months back, was that they're going to allow civilians through without any baggage, luggage, anything like that. And then they're going to pummel Gaza. So it was one of those things where you filter out the upper part, almost like when you put alum in dirty water and all the muck settles at the bottom
That's
and the
right.
water remains on top. And they've concentrated them out there. They're going to let civilians through, or at least unarmed people through. They have no way of telling if these guys are civilians or not, but at least unarmed people through. And whoever remains, well, God bless you, or God help you rather, or maybe the devil help you. I don't know. That's what they're planning out there. Now, it's very important we understand that Gaza, even when we were there, was very clearly getting supplied. Right. There is no shortage of supplies. People have been trying to make up famine stories and medical shortage supply stories, which we know even a little bit of digging will show you that that's simply not the case. The
There are
Israelis are
several bakeries open in Gaza, and which are baking
bakery.
bread constantly and so on and so forth.
Yeah, bread, meat, rice, everything. Sure, you're probably not getting as much as you used to, but there is definitely no famine or starvation or anything happening out there at the moment. In fact, there is a surplus enough that we know for a fact that Hamas, there's lots of videos to show you that Hamas has been hoarding stuff and trying to sell it on the black market at obscene rates, which is probably why that aid trucks are being attacked by normal Gazans, because they don't want to pay Hamas. Even this is being exploited by Hamas to make money. Right? As if, Khalid Meshal and Haniyeh stealing aid money wasn't enough. This is another war profiteering is another thing that these people do. Now, We also need to remember, a term that's used very often to describe this is proportionality. I've never heard a more stupid definition of proportionality because, the response to 7th October isn't Israelis going and taking 130 hostages and raping and killing Palestinian women. Proportionality is not a response. Proportionality is subject to your war aims. If you have a war aim which says we are going to get rid of Hamas, are your military actions proportionate to your stated war aims? That is the test of proportionality. Finally, with regards to the pressure on Israel, there is intense pressure, but it is largely political pressure because all the military people that I know in, say, France or Germany or Britain or America are telling me, well, militarily, we have very little to criticize. This is very hard intel. Every time we ask for intel, they show us why a certain building was targeted, and it's actually quite a legit target. Mistakes happen, of course, they do happen, like the killing of those kitchen, the food for whatever workers out there, for which two Israelis have been sacked from
Kitchen workers, yeah.
world kitchen workers. But overwhelmingly, it's been fairly this thing. Problem is, it's not nice. You see, it's horrible. War is horrible. I mean, if people thought war was like, PlayStation, they're sadly mistaken. This is what war actually looks like. And the problem, of course, is Macron is facing elections very shortly. There's also a general European swing that this has gone on for too long. It's too intense for too long. You see, the American invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the first 10, 15 days were very intensive, and then it went into a long counterinsurgency.
Yes.
It hasn't entered long counterinsurgency. It's entered long, for 6 months, it's been intense war, which is not something a Western audience is used to, which is why the mood has also turned out there. In America, again, it's political compulsion because, on one hand, Biden depends on Jews are extremely educated, like Indians. This is why there's a huge intermarriage between Jews and Hindus called Hindus in America. They're urban, extremely educated, extremely white collar. 99% of them will have a secondary college degree and be working white collar jobs. They are overwhelmingly Democrat voters. And the problem here is that on one hand, all your fundraising depends on New York and California Jews. On the other hand, your ground voter strength is determined by a large Muslim population out there, which actually, like in India, comes out and votes, you see, on demand. So that's a very important factor that Biden's trying to balance. And the fact that a lot of New York Democrat Jews hate Netanyahu kind of helps Biden's hand on this, but he also has a balancing act to play.
Talk to us a little bit about something else that seems apparent. In many ways, it's no secret that this conflict was triggered by Hamas, by Hamas with support from Iran to stop the Abraham Accords from playing out. There was a distinct sign that the Israelis and the Arabs, especially the biggest Arab countries, were making peace with each other, historic peace in many ways, right? And that, of course, for vested interests could not be allowed to proceed in that sense, right? And this conflict got triggered. But there's also a sense, Abhijit, that globally also, this Palestinian issue is now coming to some sort of a flashpoint, patience around the world, both within the Jewish community and otherwise, is, perhaps is wearing thin, if it hasn't already worn thin. Also, it has got conflated in a sense in Western societies with many things, with the crisis with Islam in many parts of the Western world, with the crisis with woke culture in many parts of the Western world. So all of this has become a very volatile mix, Abhijit, and in a sense, therefore, is even more tumultuous. Where do you see all of this panning out? As we go towards a big American election.
Look, this conflation with everything was bound to happen in America because intersectionality is the key. They're trying to find as many victim groups as possible to weave together a coalition of losers, as I call them. So, it's all the losers, like the communist thing, workers of the world unite. This is losers of the world unite. Genitally mutilated people, trans people, mentally diseased people, radical Muslims, radical trans Jews. There are those as well. A lot of them, thanks to mental issues, call themselves Jews. They're trans. They've undergone sex change surgery and they support Palestine and things like that, chickens for KFC kind of thing. It was only a matter of time before this was also absorbed into their coalition of hate and coalition of losers. So this was bound to happen. This is how intersectionality works, right? I mean, we've seen this everywhere. The communists used to advocate for, when they've taken over Russia in the Russian Civil War in the 19 teens, 17 onwards, till about 23, 24, we're all advocating this sort of, Muslims of Central Asia have been oppressed by the Tsar. You need to be liberated. And then when they came to power, they cracked down on Muslims in Central Asia far harsher than any Tsar ever had, including General Kaufman Turkestansky, who was the worst of the lot. Who actually he called Turkestansky because he conquered Turkestan for the Tsar. So this is kind of natural. I expected this to happen. It doesn't change the equation because, see, people who don't like Israel, this hasn't changed anybody's mind. Let's be clear about it. We've just seen a more open expression of Jew hatred and the coming together of this coalition of losers to target Israel and Jews. But there was always subcutaneous anti-Semitism that did not bear its fangs, so to say. This has just been an occasion where the fangs have been bared. That's all. It was always going to be an anti-Israel thing.
Allow me for a moment to play devil's advocate here, Abhijit. A lot of what you say in broad terms is correct, of course, and there's historical evidence of all of this. There's also evidence that Bill Clinton's famous speech that he went out on a limb to try and give Palestinians Palestine, and and yet the Palestinians never accepted, and there is a lot of history to that too. However, in recent years, there has also been a concern about growing Israeli settlement in many parts, which seems to have triggered conflict where perhaps some of it was not required. Do you think that part? How do you see that part play out now? Now that all of this violence has happened, how do you see that part play out?
Very good question. So let me tell you what those settlements are actually part of a plan. It's not an annexation plan. It's actually a force them to the negotiating table plan. So let's go back to the Oslo Accords, which for the first time gave the Palestinians self-rule. People don't realize this, but Gaza wanted to annex it. And the West Bank wasn't even considered Palestine by the Jordanians till 87 or 89, right. I think, till King Hussein formally said, okay, I don't consider this part of my territory. He considered the whole of Israel to be part of his territory, technically, right? So he said, no, it's not part of my territory. I concede that this is a Palestine. Now, in when the Oslo Accords were signed, 93, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, the deal was that the Palestinians will get self-rule and will slowly work towards final status negotiations for a full state. And this had a precedent because, 73, when the war ended, the Yom Kippur War ended, within a few months, Anwar al-Sadat flew to Tel Aviv. And the peace negotiations took another 6 years. It was long, slow, extremely frustrating negotiations. And finally, in those negotiations, the entire of Sinai was returned to Egypt. All the settlements were dismantled and moved out.
That's right.
The Egyptians didn't want Gaza because Gaza was a hellhole of radicalization even then. Right. Then in 2005, when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, again, all the settlements were dismantled. 100% of the settlements were dismantled.
Including Israel, tombs were moved out. People, a lot of people don't know that.
All the graves, all the Jewish graves were removed and reinterred in Israeli soil and things like that. So Israel has actually got a record not once, but twice of delivering 100% on its promises to withdraw from territory. Now let's look what happened from Bill Clinton, that Camp David Accord onwards. That Camp David Accord that Yasser Arafat refused to sign, what were the sticking? First, let's talk about the deal and the sticking points then. The deal was you will get 97% of all the occupied land, which is to say Gaza plus, because the Gaza was still under Israeli occupation at that time, plus the West Bank, you will not get Jerusalem, but you will get land in lieu of Jerusalem. Some of the Jerusalem attached annexations would remain under Israeli control because that's cemented control over this. The Israelis would guarantee investment. They would guarantee job movement and transport movement and things like that. They would guarantee water, which was a very important factor in those days. They would not agree to, and these were the sticking points, to Jerusalem, and they would not agree to a return of population, right? And this is very natural because when you have partition, an exchange of population is an accepted principle. It's happened between Turkey and Greece. It's happened between India and Pakistan. There are hundreds of places, Cyprus, another case, where this, or even recently under NATO, Bosnia, not Bosnia, sorry, Kosovo, which has been completely cleansed of its Serb population under the watch of NATO, right? This was what the Western powers imposed on Germany, where all the Eastern Polish, the Prussian and the Sudeten Germans were kicked out and sent to Bavaria, and almost a million of them died in that forced eviction of this thing. So Palestine went on, because this has been the Palestinian negotiating tactic, where they say, oh, you gave us all of this in 97. You promised all of this in Camp David in 97. Now what can you do on top of that? And the Israelis are like, boss, this is not how a negotiation works. I say 100, you say 50. I come down to 95, you come up to 55. You don't go down to 20 then. And this is what the Palestinians believe, that what they rejected was actually accepted. And that is the baseline from which all further agreement, that wasn't the baseline. That was the maximalist, right? So this has been a constant problem out there where, Palestinians have never been negotiating in good faith. And there's a very good reason for it. If you look, the population both in the West Bank and in Gaza was actually very stable till the 1990s. And this was when, from the 67 war onwards to 1990, Israel turned what was a horribly backward place into essentially a second world country. Sanitation, electricity, housing, water supply, toilets, everything was done on the Israeli taxpayer dime. And in the 90s, the moment they get self-rule, the entire strategy was to swamp Israel with the numbers. So there are a total of 2 million Muslim Arab Israelis. There are 2 million people in the Gaza Strip, and there are about 2.4 million people in the West Bank, about 6.5 million Arab Muslims compared to 7.2 million Jews. And the entire aim has been to say, okay, we're no longer under occupation, we're one country, but there are more Muslims than Jews, and therefore end of the Jewish state, which Israel is never going to accept. And what has happened, and in many ways, this is Netanyahu's stupidity, which a lot of the left, surprisingly, in Israel have been pointing out, is this is their plan. You need to enact a two-state solution right now, or else the Jewish nature of the Jewish state will go. And if they start demanding equal rights, if they accept their Israelis, which they've refused to accept so far, we're finished. And every time that I've been to Gaza and the West Bank, they don't even hide this. They openly admit that, demography is destiny, that line thing. Now, what happens is Israel then is faced with a dilemma. They're like, if we withdraw without an agreement like we did from Gaza in 2005, there are no guarantees. These people will continue to attack us. And then what's the point of having withdrawn from Gaza? It ends up exactly where it has today. So they can't do that. But the Palestinians won't give them agreement. So what do they do in order to force the Palestinians to the negotiating table is they keep building more and more and more settlements, saying we will make those negotiations impossible for you. So what the Palestinians tried to do, saying what you offered us, which we rejected, is the starting point, and from now on, everything is on top of that. What the Israelis are saying is the reverse. All the settlements are now the starting point, and from here, it is diminishing returns for you. So so never confuse the negotiating strategy with what the end result can be. Because even in 97, The initial offer of land was 67% to Arafat, and based on good behavior, because remember, even at that point of time, a lot of terror attacks were happening, which is why Shimon Peres lost his prime ministership because of the bus bombings in Tel Aviv that had happened. And the rule was that you would slowly, based on good behavior, keep handing over parcels of land till the full 97% of land was achieved.
And also, and the story that you tell is absolutely, lucid, and thank you, and clear, and there's historical evidence for all of this. And let's not forget, in 2005, you mentioned how Israel turned what was essentially scrubland and desert into a second, world country.
Hindol,
Um,
I just need to add something very quickly. Sorry to interrupt
Please.
you. When I first went to Israel some 35 years back when I was 11 years old, Israel was a very poor country. It looked like Karol Bagh or Rohini or one of those horrible North Delhi places. People in South Delhi don't even uh, realize that, North Delhi looks a bit like a Dhaka slum. Uh, Israel was dirt poor. The kind of civic and urban development you've seen to the kind of glitzy Tel Aviv and glitzy Jerusalem you've seen today has only happened in the last 35 years. And in spite of that, they invested a lot of money out in those places. And people don't realize how much that entire region had been totally desertified. Today, even when you fly from Jordan to Israel, you will see the Jordanian desert and you can mark the border exactly, because where the border is literally 10 meters from that side, it is lush green. And people don't realize in Roman times and Jesus's time, that area was actually very green. It was kind of like Greece or Italy or something like that, which got completely deforested during the Mamluk and Ottoman period and turned into a desert, literally.
Well, I mentioned this because, you know, Israel's drip irrigation is the magic, right? And Israel's great kibbutzes and Israel's ability to, desalinate water and so on and so forth. But the point I was trying to make is that, you mentioned 2005. I remember the great greenhouses that Israel had built, which Hamas immediately, dismantled all of them and destroyed,
Totally.
which is one of the great self-inflicted wounds any society can make upon itself. I mean,
And you see,
that's
they
your source of
wanted to do
food,
that.
and
They wanted to do that because there were two aspects to this. One was a collective Palestinian aspect to outpopulate the Jews. The second was a constant state of siege and war that Hamas wanted ever since it won the Palestinian 2006 election. Remember, the Israeli withdrawal happened in 2005, and Gaza was doing pretty well. Because it was an agricultural wonderland. I have actually been in 35 years back. My first visit to Israel with my mom was to a kibbutz which no longer exists called Kafar Darom. And the kind of peanuts they were growing, olives they were growing, and things like that, they were exported to the entire world, very high value crops. And the lifestyle was something to behold. Even in those days, when Israel wasn't that rich, it was certainly a lot richer than India, even in those days. And, coming as I did from India 35 years back, people don't remember how much poverty, in your face poverty you used to see.
oh,
You go here and it was fantastic in that sense, right? So what ended up happening was that they dismantled all of that. Why? So that there would be perpetual rage against the Israelis. High population, no jobs. You're creating any economist will tell you or sociologist will tell you that this is essentially creating a society based on rage, except it isn't targeted at the government that did it to you. It's targeted at somebody you want to keep calling occupier and oppressor, even though Gaza wasn't under occupation.
last, couple of points, Abhijit. Do you think, in some senses, this is a turning point for Jewish society around the world? Do you think something is changing? Um, and I say this because, we are seeing anti-Semitism rise, around the world, from Australia to, of course, Europe and in Britain. I mean, the scenes that we have seen in central London, in the last few months, as many of us, who've been many times, to England, I don't know whether any of us ever thought those were scenes we would see in the heart of, in Piccadilly and, passing Hyde Park and all of that, right? So something is changing, or something has changed. And I wonder if you think, to conclude, is this a turning point for the global Jewish community, this war?
No, not at all. The fault of the Jew is that they are very rich and they live in these little cosseted dreamlands of their own making in New York and Berkeley or wherever, or in university towns, right? When Hitler was going around saying, I'm going to kill Jews, I am going to implement apartheid against you, the Jews were the ones saying, no, he doesn't really mean it, this is just hyperbole and things like that. This is one of those stages where I've seen with these New York Jews and London Jews and Paris Jews, they're not feeling it because they feel, see, most of these protests are happening in weird off places or they think it's one off. I don't think they've woken up to it. Some have, just like some did to Hitler.
Oh.
But I don't think they have, because had they woken up to it, their entire stance on the Labour Party, on the Democrats, on Macron would have been very different from what you're seeing right now. Far from it. Far from it. I think the average Jew outside Israel, maybe only 10, 12% of them have woken up, and the rest are still living in chronic delusion.
Iyer-Mitra, we leave it at that. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure, to hear from your wide experience in dealing with the Middle East, especially with Israel, and your first-hand experience of visiting Israel and looking at that conflict very closely. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Hindol. Always a pleasure talking with you. It's just fun that we can get much more in depth on your conversations than I normally can.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.